everyone. I'm Laura Persley with IATRIX Systems. Welcome back to our Fall Exchange Privacy and Security track. Our topic for today is Security as a Moving Target, How to Plan for the Future. Our speakers are Sean Phillips from Greycastle Security and Melinda Ramble-Stone from Provation Medical. Sean is the Director of Strategic Partnerships with Greycastle Security. Over the past 4 years, Sean has been a key player within the organization, helping to build over 3 teams internally that have positioned Greycastle for the future. Today, Sean leads the Greycastle Security Partner Program, which is responsible for strategic alignment with the industry, present and future, promoting collaborative solutions for clients, and maintaining thought leadership across all areas of the cybersecurity ecosystem. Sean also teaches cybersecurity policy and law at the Rochester Institute of Technology. Melinda is the Vice President and Chief Information Security Officer with Provation Medical. She is an executive security leader with extensive experience building and leading security programs in technology, healthcare, and financial services. She specializes in cloud security architecture and enterprise information security programs. Melinda leads Provation's security and compliance programs. Now I'll turn it over to Sean to get us started.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Laura. And thank you to the IATRIX team for hosting Melinda and myself today. We really appreciate the opportunity to speak to others that are working in the field, trying to make the most of all the change that's been going on today and throughout 2020. It's for sure been a very difficult year for many people, and especially in this field, in the healthcare field, there have been a lot of new challenges that have presented themselves to us, whether we're in IT, security, legal, or compliance. And I have the benefit of being able to co-present here today. And I'm going to lean a lot on Melinda through her experience that she's had, both as a CISO involved in legal and compliance in the medical field. So thank you also to Melinda for giving your time today and presenting with Greycastle with IATRIX.
I'm happy to be here, and I look forward to the conversation, Sean. Thank you.
Awesome. So with that, what we're going to talk about today, Laura was great at giving the overview for the presentation. We're going to try to cover 3 core topics. 2020 so far, a sanity check, because I think we all need one as of today in 2020, and then moving forward, what do we do now? So with that, before we go too far, I want to try to set the stage from a cybersecurity risk management perspective. So Greycastle's been in business for a long time. We've been around since 2011. That might not sound like a long time to some people on the phone who maybe have worked for health systems or hospitals that have been around since the early 20s or even before. But for cybersecurity consulting firms, that's a fairly reasonable tenure. So in starting, we went and we tried to present the conversation of a risk-based cybersecurity program. And at the time, it was new, and we got laughed out of a lot of conference rooms by trying to get people to focus on risk. And so to set the stage here today, we've since then done hundreds of risk assessments and many different risk-based approaches to cybersecurity for healthcare organizations. And when we finish our assessments, we always sit down with the executive team and with the IT team. And before we go over our top risk findings, we ask them, what do you think we found? What do you think are going to be the top risk areas? Because from our perspective, cybersecurity is an organizational issue. It's a culture issue. It's an organizational issue that needs to be driven from the top down in many perspectives. So when we ask that question, we get a myriad of different responses, but generally the aggregate responses end up looking like this. The C-suite thinks this. Probably can't hear this, but the image is really worth 1,000 words. So the C-suite will look at us and they'll say, well, guys, I really think we're making great progress. We've got everything under control. We've been giving IT and security everything they asked for. We basically have a force shield around our company. We've got everything locked down, and we believe that we're in a good place. And we know that answer is not completely accurate, but we still, that's the answer we get on an aggregate basis. Then we look over at the IT team and we say, okay, is this true? Do you really feel like, from an IT, from a security perspective, that you guys are in a good place? And the answer we get from them is very different. It looks something like this. They say, we're going out of our minds. We have too many things to manage. Not only do we have to continue to provision all the IT and security related functions of core systems, we have to make sure that there's availability, that people are able to integrate and log in and access all the systems that they need to on a daily basis. We also have all of these new initiatives around cybersecurity. We have all these initiatives around patient safety and health. And it's difficult for us to keep up. We don't know how to focus our time. We're only a group of X people. So there's this constant tug of war and a bit of a misunderstanding between the executive team and the IT team. And it's important to talk about because at the end of the day, we end up at a place where we have conversations with both groups and they both kind of look at us from different perspectives, but they say, hey, look, like this is hard. And we have to come back and say, it is hard. Why do you do it? And this all ties together into the concept of change and 2020. So let me try to wrap this together. So why do we do cybersecurity in the first place? And in many cases, it's because we have to. So whether you're in healthcare, whether you're international and you're in perhaps a SaaS startup, whether you're working on government contracts, there's someone somewhere telling you, hey, don't forget about me, don't forget about us, you still have to do this. And when it comes to healthcare specifically, we're talking HIPAA as it relates to health information, among other regulatory schemes that we have to comply with. So at the end of the day, it's hard. There's a misunderstanding as far as what needs to be done and how to prioritize that. And we come to the constant conversation around security and compliance, and this comes into great focus here as we start to have a conversation throughout the rest of this presentation around what is security, what is compliance, and how does it play into a constant state of change like we've seen in 2020? How do we use things like COVID and things like what we've been walking through and working through for the last number of months, upwards of 10 months, coming on 11 now, to our advantage? So to finalize the stage here, before we jump into some conversation together, security versus compliance is a never-ending battle. And on one hand, you can see the organization wanting to comply with many things because you can check the box and you can say, I'm good, I've complied, I've followed the rules, and I'm good as far as the regulatory bodies say. And then on the other hand, you get security. And from a security perspective, you have a lot of other things you could be doing, and you may be solving things from a compliance perspective that really aren't touching security, and you may be doing things from a security perspective that are really in the weeds and don't help compliance. So there's a balancing act here, and as we get into some of 2020 and what we've learned, we're going to talk a little bit about that balancing act as we try to peel back the onion on what's been going on and how we've diversified our workforce and sent many of them home, and how we can stay in compliance and keep security at a reasonable level. So with that really sets the stage and is the intro. So what we're going to do is we're going to talk through these questions as if they're questions coming from the group here that's dialed in, listening, and viewing this presentation. So I'm going to pass this to Melinda, who has great experience and has had to bring her company through the core of all of these questions. And so Melinda, if you would, could you get us started here in going through some of these questions, starting with whichever one you'd like to, and talking through how you and Provation see these questions and how you've been able to work through them?
Sure, absolutely. Thank you, Sean. Welcome, everyone. First of all, Provation Medical is a surgical software company. We have offices throughout the country. Our core office is in Minneapolis, and we have offices in multiple states across the country. And we are very focused on healthcare because we develop healthcare software. We're very HIPAA compliant. So we already had a security program and structure around it. But I want to take us all back to March 16th. That was the day here in Minnesota, at least, that the governor called us to all go remote and to, we called it shelter at rest in Minnesota. Other places called it lockdown, whatever the words were. But it was at that point in time that we had to initiate our business continuity plan, specifically the use cases around pandemic events. And so when you ask the question, how did COVID impact your security program? I can tell you that we did not have a pandemic use case until maybe a week before we started into the shelter at rest in March. And the reason why was because my team said, you know, Melinda, it feels like this is happening or has the potential to happen. Let's write a scenario and use cases around COVID or around pandemic event, and we'll just see what happens. And within 1 week, the head of HR in our organization came to me and said, we've been asked and tasked to initiate business continuity. And so when you think about that, how does COVID impact your security program? As you said earlier, Sean, security is much bigger than just compliance or much bigger than just technology. It's the overarching impact to the business. So all of our organization was affected by the business continuity plan and by what we had to do. One, we had to think about all the risks around COVID, around all the risks around remote. And then we had to look at our control structure and identify where are our gaps, because there's always gaps. as you pointed out, with your cute little kitty trying to do the whack-a-mole thing, there's always gaps. And so we had to start working on it. So it was identifying those extra risks, identifying those extra gaps, and then coming up with a remediation plan around that.
And Melinda, can you speak to how you identify? So as far as your priorities, you must have a ton of priorities in working through that continuity plan, and then trying to find those gaps, and then trying to find the time to fix those gaps. What do you do to get the organization to come to your aid to help understand that that is a priority?
Right. So I'm a big believer in the ISO 27001 and the NIST standards. So within those protocols and standards, it's an expectation that you follow a strong risk management program, both the identification of it and then also the remediation around it. So we already had this structure, but what we didn't have is all these extra areas of risk, because we were not a company that worked remotely. We were not a company that had ever dealt with a pandemic event. We were not a company that suddenly had to stop traveling and installing software at customer sites because the CDC had given us guidance, no travel, right? So we had all these new things that we had to deal with. So we had to look at additional risk categories and add those into our risk assessment and come up with a whole list of scenarios and risks and then start to treat them. So we first looked at how do we make sure that we're protecting our staff? How do we make sure that they're safe in their environment? Are we making sure that they have the right health protections in place if they need to go to a customer site, because our software is installed in hospitals and surgical centers? So we had to get PPE. You know, there were all these questions that we had to start asking. Should we even allow them to travel? All the questions that we had to just work through the list, and then we had to look at, is human life involved? That was, question number one, because there were so many risks that we had to identify it this way. So we looked at human life, we looked at process, we looked at technology, we started to categorize it in that way, and we just followed the current methodology and then added to it. Does that help answer the question, Sean?
It does, yeah. Thank you, Melinda. That's good. That's a good answer. Awesome. So as far as the business continuity plan, you spoke to that a little bit. You said that Provation was a little bit surprised, as everybody was. I mean, who could be prepared for something like COVID-19 or any of the other things that have come our way in 2020? When it comes to testing that plan and then updating it, how did you do around executive buy-in for enhancements to the plan? So maybe you found areas where you had to get the company on board with a change or an update that would affect the whole organization. Did you struggle there? Were you able to make that case pretty easily?
So that's a great question. So in our ISO governance structure, I'm actually the owner of the business continuity standard and plan, and have always had great support from it. But because of the pandemic event that started, I knew that we probably needed to take a different angle to it. So I went to my executive security committee and asked them to temporarily reassign the standard to our head of HR. And the reason I did that was because it was very impactful across the organization, and I knew that I needed someone who had that skill set, who touched the people, who directly interfaced all the time, because I needed that voice. So I partnered very closely with HR, got approval from our executive security committee, and then we were then positioned she and I to move forward. So that meant I always tell her I was her security detail. I was the one who was I was had her back, helping her focus on where our priorities should be from a security risk perspective, and identifying all those areas. The other area that we also had to consider was just all of the recommendations from the CDC, that we had to even consider. So if you have ever read the CDC website in detail, I hope you haven't, but if you have, there's all kinds of guidance in terms of what companies need to do. You have to have a social distancing policy. You have to have sanitation policy. You have to have travel policy. What happens if your employees get sick? So I had to write all kinds of policies and incorporate those into our business continuity standard and plans. And that was not something on the beginning of my list at the start of 2020. 100% sure on that. So one of the great things about our organization is that our committee is executive level, C-level. So I had the support of my C-level group already, and we would meet regularly. I would give them updates, and then the head of HR and I would meet with our CEO to make sure we had his buy-in, because that's key. The second you lose that buy-in is the second that your program might begin to fail. So it's still a work in progress because we're still in the middle of a pandemic, but so far we're in operational mode of a pandemic.
Excellent. It's excellent. It's weird to say and it's weird to speak to, but it sounds like great progress that you made with the head of HR. And it sounds like too, Melinda, if I'm hearing you right, having that committee in place before the pandemic is really what made the difference. You had the buy-in already and you just had to help coach them on what the risks were. Can you speak a little bit more to how you build that committee?
Yeah, absolutely. So I'm a big believer, as I've mentioned before, in strong risk management and strong compliance programs. I think that they're the heart of the security program. So one of the first things that I did when I joined Provation, I was hired to build a security program for them, was to formulate and form an executive committee. So under the ISO standard, there's a section on governance planning, and so I worked with that executives to identify what the plan should look like and who should be made up of a committee. And then that was one of my key tenets, because I couldn't move forward until I had that support. They needed to support the program. They needed to support the objectives of the security program. They needed to support the structure of it. And then they also needed to support the funding, because that's where it's really all at in security. We know how to spend. So that was key. That foundation really was the start of it all. And then from that, then I could then move forward and hire the right people, start doing risk identification. And my first time through, we actually used an outside resource to do our risk assessment, and then from that we've subsequently brought it in-house.
Awesome.
But we do it all the time. All the time.
That's awesome. That's a good foundation here for others that are maybe struggling to put that committee together or get that buy-in. And one more question on that, then we can move forward. I have a question around any pushback you got. So the concept of being involved in risk and giving up their time to sit on a committee, and it's probably the last thing that anyone ever wants to see land in their inbox in a way. Or you can have maybe a more proactive or forward-thinking C-suite and executive team that really knows that security is important. So have you experienced both, and what did you experience with this group, and did you get any pushback that you had to overcome? And if so, can you give any advice to people that are here around how you overcame that pushback?
Right. So great question. There's anybody that tells you what went off perfectly is probably not giving you the full story, right? So we had many, interesting questions and challenges along the way, and part of it is finding the right departments at the right level. So going in too low with support isn't the right makeup of a group. So you have to find those key decision makers, those people that have concern around the success of your security program and are also control owners. I'm a huge believer that your control owners cannot be individual manager level. They have to be at the executive level. So our vice president of HR, our CFO, our CTO, they all own security controls for their respective areas. They might certainly delegate responsibility down, but it is on them. And the reason that's so important is because that's how you build support. That's how you build purpose. That's how you all move forward together. That's how you protect your organization. And it took me a couple stops and starts and moving forward to get us there, but it's so much more effective and has been so beneficial to the organization, because now everybody cares, because they're their controls, and they want their controls. They want their parts of the business to be successful.
That's awesome. So you tied some of the motivation back to their desire to excel with their teams in their role. Is that what I'm hearing? Yeah.
And so for example, all those security controls in NIST and in ISO that are operational, well, that falls heavily on technology. How do you develop software? That's, again, software engineering. So those individuals want to make sure that they're performing properly. It's the same thing with HR. They want to make sure that they're hiring properly, that they're following through in their background checks, and that they're offboarding properly. All of those controls fall under the HR security. So making sure that they understand that they're responsible for them is certainly part of that. So I did a lot of individual one-on-one with all of these members to help them understand and educate them. There's nothing wrong with educating. We can't expect that people are going to know things straight out of the gate. I live and breathe security, and I understand that not everybody does. I get it. And not everybody's as intense as I am. And but I am also a big believer in teaching and helping people grow and get to that right next level. So I'm a big fan of paying it forward. And so that's how I did it. I always do it this way. It's all about the partnership. It's all about the collaboration. It's all about helping the organization from a strength perspective. A good example. So when we all went remote, we knew that we had to add some additional technical controls in our environment, obviously, but those technical controls had never been in place. And when you get technical controls in place, suddenly staff feel like big brother and big sister are monitoring them and watching them. It's super creepy, right? I kind of like it, but it's probably not, it's probably not optimal. There's probably a softer touch to it. So we worked with the CTO, and I worked with our head of HR, and we came up with a communication plan around, this is why we're moving to MFA. This is why we're managing our endpoints. This is why we're monitoring, and we brought people along in that way versus just installing it and turning it on. Now, granted, I have to tell you, I just really wanted to turn it all on because we were in the middle of pandemic and everybody was now, so they weren't remote and now they are in one day. So I wasn't sleeping all that well. So, but I recognized also that there's strength in numbers. And so that's when I partnered with my peers to get it in place.
That's good. So it sounds like a lot did change, and you were able to work with HR to accomplish that change through your executive security committee, which you'd had in place previously, but you were able to kind of implement that committee to stay up with recommendations from the CDC and others to implement changes to your continuity plan, as well as when you had to roll out new security controls for people working from home, you were able to leverage HR to soften that message to make sure that people didn't feel that it was coming from more of an authoritarian perspective, but more of a, hey, we're coming out here and we're rolling out these new procedures to protect all of our information as well as your information and keep you safer at home.
Exactly. And what's interesting about that is our staff was very receptive. The majority of the staff were very receptive. They accepted all the security controls that we put in place in terms of our company owned and managed resources. And then we also were pleasantly surprised that the communications were effective and they were okay with installing on their own personal devices if they needed to, and just taking their own levels of accountability and being proud to protect the organization. It's been really great to see, and that makes me feel very happy because it is, we're all in this together, and certainly we work and then we stop working and have a life, right? Even though your office is your house, but people are very concerned and passionate about protecting the organization, and I'm seeing that not just in my company, but in many of my peers, and I have peers across the country, CISO peers, and they're all saying the same kinds of things, that staff are interested in being part of the solution. They just need to understand what and why before you go into the how.
It's so true. And I do want to touch a little bit on, increase of threats or threat vectors when people did go home and whether or not you saw anything there. But before we do that, let me jump to the next question on the next slide here, and because some of this will start to pull itself into the conversation. So how can we use 2020 and the many situations it gave us, good or bad, to continue to push for best practice and alignment with current and future goals? So as far as positioning for the future and using 2020 kind of as to the extent we can, a positive springboard towards both increasing things like our ability to react to pandemics and updating our business continuity plan, partnering with HR in critical ways to roll out new functions. How else are you using this this year and this crisis to be able to position the security function inside of Provation for the future?
So I think there's many areas that we were doing, but we're also using I like to say that we're using this as a COVID opportunity, is what I call it, because you can have it affect you in a negative way, or you can turn it into a positive. And so some of the things that we're doing are coming up, instead of saying, oh, we can't travel anymore to the customer site, we're looking really closely at how do we deploy without having to travel to the customer site? How do we virtually deploy? Obviously, there's a huge connection of security in there, because if we're coming up with virtual solutions, we want to make sure that those solutions are safe and secure. So there's all kinds of cross-functional collaboration happening around that. And that's really interesting to me, because I think you have a choice. You can just let the pandemic event control you, or you can take it as an opportunity and innovate. I love to come up with ideas for innovation around that. So we're looking at how do we come up with new products? How do we do more automation in terms of our current processes? So we have a lot of manual processes, but do they need to be manual? And wouldn't it be more effective if we did it that way, so that it was more consistent across all of the steps, and more successful when we finally do get audited, because we've got good documentation and evidence to show that we successfully completed it. There's a whole slew of things that you really can do to improve it. I also think, and we've made some changes in terms of how we assess risk. Initially, we started by doing an annual risk assessment and treatment, and that's just too long. A year is too long between the treatment, identification and treatment of the risks. So we then moved to quarterly, and that still too long, because there's too many changes happening. And so now we're doing, we do an annual risk assessment, and then we treat those risks monthly. And we now are starting to do treating risks throughout the month.
That's fantastic. That's fantastic.
Because there's just too many risks, and they just keep getting added to the list.
That's good. That's a great example of innovating from a security perspective. So can you speak a little more to, and then I'll jump us to the next question, but can you speak briefly a little bit more to the concept of risk assessments? They're a snapshot in time. It's kind of like a pen test. You get one instance of risks that were found by whether you're doing it internally or externally. So as far as being able to use that, I love the idea of being able to make that more frequent, and a lot of that can come down to bandwidth and efficiency and automation. So can you speak to how you've been able to, did you have to hire a bunch more people? Did you just get more efficient? Like, how were you able to make that a monthly exercise? Because I feel like there's probably many people on this call that could benefit from that answer.
Yeah, so I don't have a big team. I have a very small team, first of all, my core security and compliance team. But I like to say that everybody owns security in my organization. I like to have friends. I go to the different areas, and I make partners. I find partners in each respective department area, because that's really where the control owners sit, right? And so if you can partner with those control owners who own the risk, and if the risk is realized, it's now an issue, right? So they're resolving the issue. So people don't want to put on more work on their plate than they probably have to. So I'm always asking the question, well, okay, so we can make this a paper process, or wouldn't it be cool if we automated it? How would you automate it? Unless you have bandwidth or resources to hire 2 more people, do you? And I ask it, and we'll talk about it that way, and because everybody's resource strapped already, and so everybody wants to do the right thing. So coming up with cool, innovative ways to do it has been very successful. So my team is really, my core security team is very focused on making sure we remediate those risks. So that's how we do it. It's a trick because we're responsible for owning the function, but we're not responsible for owning all the risks, right? The risks are allocated across the organization. We're like it's a spoke and hub kind of a thing happening.
Yep.
So everybody now owns security and the risks that come from them.
That's fantastic. So actually, in your case, so this is good. So just to drive this home, so what you've done is you've been able to create strong partnerships with other groups. So let's pretend CFO, for example, that finance might own 62 risk areas. really what your team's responsible to do then is go check in with finance, say, how have you in the last month, how has your risk changed in these 62 areas? Do we need to update anything? Do we need to change anything? So they're proactively working on those on your behalf, on security's behalf, because they own the risk in there.
Yeah, that's exactly right. And it's interesting because what I try and do is not use my language, but I'll just say, help me understand, how are you managing your vendors right now? Can you walk me through that process? How have you changed it? Have you added any tooling? Wouldn't it be cool if you could add some tooling that would take that paper process and capture the vendors and the questions? Talk about it that way. Talk about it in terms of solving versus making them use my Melinda language, my security language, which is difficult, right? And is not business focused, potentially. Yeah. So I changed the language, I changed the conversation.
That's huge. I think that's a good takeaway for this group too. So you don't attack this from a bits and bytes perspective. You're not going in saying, you have a high critical vulnerability or anything like that. You're coming in and speaking their language, saying in your space, from a business perspective, how can I help you?
Yeah, and just to play off of that as well, another good example. So we're a software company, so we develop software, both on-prem and SaaS-based. And so I talk to the software engineering teams and I say, hey, how are you handling all your vulnerabilities? How are you finding out about them? And I sit in meetings with that team, and they run the scans. They do all the scanning on their software. They address the vulnerabilities and take them out of the code. I don't do it. I'm just there making sure they're doing it. Not because but it's a partnership. And that's a really important part because they own the control. I'm just there to help shepherd them to get it to protect it.
That's good. That's good. I think you've built this to a pretty mature place, and I'm hoping that it's resonating with some of the people on the phone here as a way to leverage the time to build stronger partnerships in a time when it's probably unlikely you're going to get a whole bunch more resources because of companies are generally speaking pretty strapped right now, trying to get on their feet and stay on their feet and move forward. So I love the approach you took, Melinda. It sounds like it's been very successful. All right, so jumping forward, is COVID helping hospitals and health systems to gain new perspective on security and patient safety plans? So I know we spoke on this a little bit, so this is a bit of a summary question in context for what we've spoken on so far. How would you address this one?
So I'm struggling with the word helping hospitals and health systems because hospitals and health systems are significantly aware of how to handle and manage urgent situations, impactful situations. And so this is another kind of a situation. I think what's different about it is that it's having them to change their business as usual. Melinda goes to the doctor, she shows up at the clinic and she could walk through the door. That was pre-COVID. And now there's all these new types of controls that they've had to put in place. Melinda has to call before she walks into the office and let them know she's there. Then she's authorized to go in. She has her temperature checked. Just all these things that have to happen. And so they're enhancing their security plans, is what I would say. I think, and they're also going through their own challenges because they have, it's impacting their resources. It's impacting the stress around it, most certainly with their employees. And so coming up with their right solutions is part of that too. And my organization has staff go to hospitals and surgical centers, and we see it firsthand. And so we're very sensitive to making sure we follow their process. And every organization has a different process, but we want to make sure that we comply with their process because it's what they need to do their business.
It's a great answer. It's a great answer. Awesome. So anything else to add to these questions? I think we're good to move forward if you feel comfortable with where we've left this one.
I'm good.
Okay. All right. So doubtless 2020 feels a little bit like this roller coaster. It's been a bit of a couple loops here, and we're not done, and we're coming back up on even more change, most likely coming through, or if nothing else, on a further delay on coming back to what we had seen as normal previously. So with that, when we look at a year in review and we think about some of the core takeaways here from this presentation and from what we'd like people to see, yes, it's been a roller coaster. And really, we want to ask ourselves some of these questions. How effective were our processes, controls, and protective measures? Have we taken the time to understand what worked well and what did not work so well? Did we take the time to understand this and then communicate it to the business and adjust our policy as necessary? And lastly, business continuity. So I'm going to pause at this point, pass it back to you, Melinda. As far as the year in review, and again, summarizing what we've talked about so far, how effective would you say within probation your processes, controls, and protective measures were, and have you been able to communicate them clearly to and adjust policy with the rest of the organization? I want to say yes, but I don't want to speak for you, but based on how you've talked so far, it seems like you've taken this in stride.
I think the word that I would say is our processes and controls were good enough, and then COVID happened. And so then we had to evolve. Continuous evolvement, continuous evolution, and it's not stopped. I mean, we have a new pace that we're having to manage and follow in terms of our controls, in terms of our processes, and then also adding technology automation in to make sure that it's proactive measurement versus reactive measurement. So it's an evolution, and it's been a whirlwind. And so what I'm trying to do is stabilize it. You know, it might be that it's a fast pace but we're all running that fast pace consistently versus start, stop.
Yes.
I'm trying to build to some level of new consistency. And so one of the things we talk about on the COVID task force is, you know, we're trying to get to our next normal, our new normal. And I'm always saying there is no new normal. It's just what we need to do moving forward. And what we need to do moving forward is make sure we're more thoughtful about our controls, make sure that we're focused on the right controls. Mm-hmm. And I think that's an interesting question. Pre-COVID, we were heavily focused on physical security controls. So are people wearing their badges? Did they scan when they came through the door? Well, now we don't have any offices. So I don't care about the physical security controls as much, obviously. I care about what are our remote controls looking like. So we're shifting the priority. You asked it earlier, in terms of priority and importance. And it comes down to, where are you going from a business perspective? What are you focused on? And making sure that you're staying in alignment with that. Because if you lose alignment with what the business direction is and the business growth areas are, you're going to lose focus on all those areas of emphasis.
So true. And tying back to that briefly, I just want to make a connection here. So you mentioned previously an executive committee that meets on security, and then you just mentioned in your last statement a COVID committee. Can you explain the difference? And does security influence the COVID committee, or does the COVID committee influence the security committee?
Yes. So the Executive Security Committee is part of the permanent structure of the security program. And that's true not just at probation, but a strong security program always has a governing body to oversee. Because we had to initiate our business continuity plan for the pandemic event, which we lovingly call COVID-19, we formed a temporary task force that meets to talk about issues related to COVID. So it's made up of HR, security, technology, customer, and also communications. And that's all we do is focus on COVID things. And they're always coming, right?
Oh, for sure.
That group, we joke about it. Wouldn't it be great when we get to disband, even though we love meeting with each other all the time? But we'll eventually not be a task force anymore, and that's temporary.
Got it. No, that's good. I feel like that'll be a great meeting. Maybe you guys can all meet at a bar at some point in the future if things are finally back to normal. But that's really helpful to know. So you guys put together a committee so you could kind of have feelers out there to the industry, well, to your own clients, and then internally, and then also from a technology and HR perspective. That's important.
Correct.
Okay. Excellent. All right. So to really wrap this up here, what we hope that we've been able to communicate with the audience today is how to gain additional executive support. So Melinda spoke very clearly to how she pulled together this executive committee, and not just pulled it together, but she helped to explain to risk owners, those being such as like the CFO and other key executive stakeholders, what the expectations were from a risk perspective with them. So Melinda was able to work together to build partnerships with those other members of the business team to explain in their language what it meant to be proactive about cybersecurity and what it meant to manage cybersecurity. Additionally, effective strategies for helping employees understand their role in the organization's security. Melinda said that she partnered very closely with human resources so that the voice of change would come not from security with a hammer, but from human resources saying, here's why our community at Provation is rallying around security as our environment is changing, and here's why we need you on board. Can you partner with us to make this possible? Very different type of messaging. And then understanding the benefits and the risks of technology. We spoke to, Melinda specifically spoke to automation, trying to reassess what's going on in the environment, trying to do more with less and trying to be more efficient, whether it's looking at new products or whether it's trying to be a little bit more closely aligned with the long-term goals from a security and business perspective. Anything to add there, Melinda, as we wrap this up?
Yeah, I think just for the benefit of the audience, I would just like you to take this away. That it can feel like very daunting when you're adding in a new capability or in a new program or a new control. And the most important thing is just to start. It doesn't have to be a big fancy document or standard, but even just the basics. And I think about it in terms of our business continuity plan. We have matured our business continuity plan tremendously in 1 year. And that was never an area of expertise of mine, but it is now. So how'd that happen? So it's ultimately possible. The key is to reach out to your resources, reach out to your network, reach out to me. I'm happy to help. Reach out to Greg Castle. You know, we're all. This is what I love about the security community is that we're such a supportive group, and we all want to help each other succeed.
It's very well put. It's very well put, Melinda. So I believe that this brings us through to the end of our presentation. So we've got about 2 minutes left. And again, a huge thank you to Melinda. Melinda, you've been great. Thank you for walking through all these questions and answering as honestly and transparently as you have. So I'm going to pass it to Laura on the IATRIX side. If there are questions, we'd be happy to field them for the couple minutes we have here before you jump to your next event. And thank you to everyone that attended, that was listening in today. We really appreciate your time. I know this is a bit of a different style of event being all online, but appreciate your attention here and hope that this was of value to you.
Thanks, John. We do have one question. The question is, COVID probably isn't going away anytime soon. We haven't tested our backup plans yet. And Melinda, how do you recommend doing this now in a remote environment?
So, great question. So the way that we have been testing is just, well, we've had some incidents, and that was the first test. We had to figure out how to pull it back and implement it. But I do think, you know, you have to come up with a small plan. So if it's too daunting to do a big playbook in terms of testing your backups, do small chunks. Like, what are the most business critical areas of your backups? Do you care about the whole company, or is there certain areas? I think about like finance. That'd probably be the first place that I'd test. I'd test finance because they love to use those file share servers. And can we pull those back? Can we back those up? And then coming up with your plan, finance, HR, whatever those are, but doing it in small segments or small chunks to make it more palatable. That would be how I would do it.
Great, thank you. There's no more questions at this time. So unless you have anything else to add, Sean or Melinda, I can go ahead and close this out.
I'm good. Melinda, are you good?
Yeah, no, this was great. I appreciate everybody's time, and always happy to share.
Awesome. Yeah, thank you again, Melinda, for being here. And thank you, Laura, and the IATRIX team for asking us to be here today. We're happy to be here sharing and helping the community as we all try to look towards the future.
Awesome.
Great. Thank you, Sean and Melinda, for a great presentation and discussion today. And again, thanks everyone for joining us.